The house still breathed with memory. Even years after Henry's passing, Helen swore she could smell him in the faint trace of cedar, the warm musk of old books, and the polish he used on the oak banister. At 72, she moved slower now, her slippers dragging softly against the floorboards, but this was still her home, the place she and Henry had built brick by brick, memory by memory. It was close to midnight, far past the hour she usually surrendered to sleep. Tonight, though, her bed had felt too big, the silence too heavy. No matter how she shifted, her body refused rest. With a sigh, she rose, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. A warm glass of milk, that was what she needed. Something simple, something steady. But halfway down the hall, she heard them. At first Helen thought it was the television, left on in the den. The faint glow spilling from the crack beneath the door seemed to confirm it. Yet as she drew closer, she realized it wasn't a film or late-night news program. It was conversation, low, deliberate, conspiratorial. Victor's voice. Her son's voice. "She'll be gone soon anyway," he said, his words carried on a whisper but clear as a knife slicing through the dark. Helen froze where she stood, fingers gripping the banister as her chest tightened. And then another voice answered, soft but certain. "Teresa. Not a neighbor. Not a stranger. Teresa, Victor's wife. The woman Helen had welcomed into her family. The woman who had sat across her table at Christmases, smiled politely during Sunday dinners, and leaned close to kiss Helen's cheek as if affection were real." "Yes," Teresa murmured, her tone almost eager. "And once she's gone, everything will finally be ours." For a moment, Helen's mind fought against the sound. Surely she had misheard. Surely they weren't speaking about her life as though it were nothing but a hurdle in their plans. But the words lingered, undeniable. She pressed her palm to her chest, willing her heart to slow. The conversation carried on. Teresa's voice rose with excitement as she spoke of renovations, how the house would look once they had control. She imagined tearing down walls, repainting rooms, changing everything that Helen and Henry had poured themselves into. And then Victor laughed. Not the boyish laugh Helen remembered from his childhood, but something colder, something foreign. It was in that sound that the truth struck her. Her son no longer saw her as his mother. No longer saw her as a woman who had sacrificed, endured, and raised him with everything she had. He saw her as a burden. A ticking clock. A will waiting to be read. Helen's knees weakened beneath her, and she leaned harder on the banister for balance. For decades she had believed Victor's visits were gestures of care, his calls acts of love. She had trusted his wife's politeness as kindness. And in one breath, in one overheard exchange, that illusion crumbled. She wanted to storm into the room, to demand an explanation, to shout her fury and heartbreak. But her body betrayed her. Her voice caught in her throat. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. She remained there in the shadows, silent, listening as if she were an intruder in her own home. Finally, when she could bear no more, she turned. Careful not to let the floorboards creak, she made her way back to her bedroom. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the house that once comforted now pressing down like a cage. When she sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands were trembling so fiercely she had to clasp them together to still them. Tears pricked her eyes but did not fall. Her grief was too sharp, too raw, to find release. The betrayal was not only in the words spoken, but in the truth they revealed. Her son and his wife were waiting for her death, not mourning its eventuality but planning for it, speaking of it as though it were a date already marked on the calendar. Helen drew in a long, shuddering breath. She thought of Henry then, of the way he used to reassure her when life grew heavy, of the promises they made to protect what they built. She could almost hear his voice, steady and strong. "Don't let them take what's ours, Helen." In that moment, beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp, Helen knew one thing with absolute clarity. Nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Morning came softly, though Helen barely noticed the light seeping through the curtains. The echo of Victor's words lingered, sour and heavy, as if they had been etched into her bones. For decades, she had trusted her son's smile, believed his reassurances, and accepted his presence as love. But now, every gesture seemed tainted, every word subject to suspicion. It began with small things. She noticed her pill organizer sitting untouched on the counter for days, though Victor had promised to refill it each week. When she reminded him, he laughed it off, saying he had been busy, that surely she could manage on her own. But Helen knew she hadn't forgotten, he had. A careless neglect, masked in easy excuses. Visits grew shorter too. Where Victor once lingered over coffee, he now checked his watch constantly, his leg bouncing as though her stories were a burden to endure. Teresa's smiles were painted on like wallpaper, polite, practiced, and hollow. She often swept through the house, eyes scanning the antiques, the photographs, the heavy furniture that had belonged to Henry's family. It wasn't Helen she looked at with warmth, it was the house. And then, subtly, the talk of assisted living began. One Sunday afternoon, Teresa dropped the idea like a casual suggestion. "Helen, you'd be so much safer in a nice community. Somewhere with staff to help you, meals prepared, friends to keep you company." Her voice carried sweetness, but her eyes flickered with impatience. Victor chimed in, "She's right, Mom. This place is too much for you. You're rattling around in an empty house. Wouldn't it be easier to have someone take care of everything?" Helen's heart clenched. They weren't worried about her well-being, they were circling, preparing for the day she wasn't there. She forced a smile, nodding politely, but inside, something hardened. That night, she lay awake, memories flooding her. She remembered Victor as a boy, chasing fireflies in the backyard with his father, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. She remembered staying up late sewing his Halloween costume, pricking her fingers raw so he could be the proudest pirate at school. She remembered holding him after Henry's funeral, whispering through her own tears that everything would be okay. She had given everything to him, her time, her love, her sacrifices. And now, he watched the clock during her stories, counted her pills as burdens, and spoke of her end as if it were an event to anticipate. But not all love in the family had soured. One Wednesday afternoon, as she sat on the porch sipping tea, she heard the light footsteps of Grace, her granddaughter. At 16, Grace carried the same curiosity and warmth that Helen once saw in Victor as a child. She bounded up the steps, a sketchbook tucked under her arm, and kissed her grandmother's cheek. "Grandma, I brought you something," Grace said, opening the sketchbook to reveal a pencil drawing of the old oak tree in the backyard. Every branch had been captured with delicate care, every leaf a testament to patience. Helen's eyes stung. "It's beautiful, darling. You have your grandfather's talent." Grace smiled shyly. "I just wanted you to have something to look at when you're in your room. You said the tree was Dad's favorite, right?" The mention of Victor's boyhood sent a pang through Helen's chest, but she hid it behind a gentle smile. "Yes, it was. He spent hours climbing that tree, no matter how many times I told him to be careful." Grace giggled. "Sounds like Dad." They sat together, the quiet between them comfortable. Grace asked about Henry, about what life was like when Helen was her age. She listened with genuine interest, her eyes wide, her laughter bubbling freely. Unlike her father, she didn't rush the conversation. She leaned into it, eager to share the space, eager to know her grandmother's heart. When Grace finally left, Helen lingered on the porch long after, staring at the drawing. Hope, she realized, was not entirely gone. There was still love in her family, pure, untainted love. And it lived in Grace. But the cracks in the mask of her son's affection were widening. Later that week, Victor stopped by unannounced, carrying a briefcase instead of groceries. He sat at the dining table, flipping through papers. "Mom, I've been looking at some options. Assisted living isn't cheap, but if we sell the house..." Helen cut him off sharply, surprising even herself. "This house is not for sale." Victor blinked, his face tightening before smoothing into false calm. "I just mean, it would solve a lot of problems. You wouldn't have to worry about upkeep, and Teresa and I could handle all the logistics. Think of it as simplifying things. She looked at him then, really looked. The boy who once begged for another bedtime story was gone, replaced by a man calculating his inheritance while she was still alive. Her throat felt dry, but her voice was steady. I said no, Victor. He forced a smile, kissed her cheek, and left soon after. But the air he left behind felt poisoned, heavy with unspoken resentment. Helen sat at the table, staring at the papers he'd forgotten. They weren't about assisted living, they were property listings. Real estate brochures. Notes scribbled in Victor's handwriting about potential buyers. The cracks were no longer cracks. They were fractures splitting wide, revealing the truth beneath. And though her heart broke, Helen knew this much: she could no longer afford to ignore them. The days that followed felt like a balancing act on a frayed rope. Helen carried herself as though nothing had changed, smiling when Victor dropped by, nodding at Teresa's shallow chatter, thanking them both for their concern. She poured tea, offered cookies, and laughed at small talk as if her world hadn't cracked open. But inside, she watched them carefully, every gesture a clue, every slip of the tongue a revelation. If Victor and Teresa believed she was naive, so much the better. She would let them think so, all the while piecing together the truth they worked so hard to conceal. It didn't take long. One afternoon, Helen made her way to the local bank, a short walk she still enjoyed on clear mornings. The staff greeted her warmly. She had known many of them for years, back when she and Henry managed their modest investments together. Today, though, there was hesitation in the teller's eyes, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. Finally, the manager, Mr. Harris, called her into his office. He was a man of steady demeanor, always kind, but now his brow furrowed with concern. Mrs. Whitfield, he began, I don't mean to alarm you, but your son has been in here several times recently. He's been asking questions about your accounts, your trust, even inquiring about early liquidation options. Helen's fingers tightened around her handbag. Has he authority to do that? Mr. Harris shook his head firmly. Not without your written consent. We told him as much. Still, I thought you should know. He seemed quite insistent. Helen thanked him, her heart thudding as she left the office. The walk home felt longer that day. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot, but none of it reached her. Victor wasn't just waiting for her death, he was preparing for it, maneuvering, pressing, testing the boundaries of what he could take before it was time. She kept her composure when he visited that evening. He brought a bouquet of supermarket flowers, his smile overly bright. Just thought these would cheer you up, Mom. Helen arranged them in a vase, watching him from the corner of her eye. Had she not known what she now knew, she might have been fooled. But his cheer rang hollow, his questions about her health too rehearsed, his gaze lingering on the house rather than her face. It was Teresa who made the next misstep. On a Saturday morning, Helen found paperwork scattered on the kitchen counter. She assumed at first they were utility bills, but when she looked closer, her stomach dropped. Real estate brochures. Property assessments. Notes about maximizing value. And in Teresa's neat handwriting, projected profit margin once liquidated. Helen sat at the table, staring at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. Teresa had been careless, or perhaps arrogant enough to believe Helen wouldn't understand. Either way, the truth could no longer be ignored. This wasn't just idle talk. They were planning the dismantling of her life, piece by piece. She slid the papers back into place before Teresa returned, her face a mask of calm. When Teresa bustled in with a tray of muffins, Helen thanked her warmly, as though she hadn't just glimpsed her future written in ink. That night, alone in her bedroom, she opened the small wooden chest Henry had built for her on their wedding day. Inside were keepsakes, old letters, photographs, his wristwatch, her wedding band. She held the watch in her hand, hearing Henry's voice in memory, his firm, steady promise, "No one will ever take this home from you. It's yours as long as you live." Tears welled, but they hardened quickly into resolve. If Victor had inherited Henry's charm, he had not inherited his honor. That much was clear. Helen began to document everything. She wrote down dates, conversations, subtle shifts in tone. She noted when Victor failed to pick up her medication, when Teresa forgot to pay the gardener, when the house grew colder because the thermostat had been turned down without her knowledge. At first, she wondered if she was being paranoid. But the list grew longer, undeniable. And then came the night when the cracks widened further. Helen had dozed off in her armchair with a book when voices stirred her awake. Victor and Teresa were in the living room, unaware she was just down the hall. "She's holding on longer than I thought," Teresa muttered. "Honestly, it's exhausting." Victor's sigh was heavy, impatient. "I know. But Harris at the bank says once she's gone, it'll be simple. The will's still in my name. We just have to wait." "Wait," Teresa scoffed. "What if she decides to change her mind?" Victor chuckled. "She won't. She trusts me. Always has." Helen closed her eyes, heart pounding. If only they knew. She was listening now, every word carving itself into her memory. Later, when they finally left, she sat alone in the silence, staring at the flickering shadows on the wall. Their arrogance was her weapon. They underestimated her. They believed her weak, gullible, too sentimental to act. But they had forgotten something vital. Helen had lived long enough to know the difference between words and intentions. And intention spoke louder than anything else. The next morning, Grace stopped by again, her sketchbook under her arm. Helen embraced her tightly, longer than usual, drawing strength from the warmth of genuine love. "Are you okay, Grandma?" Grace asked softly, searching her face. Helen smiled, though her eyes glistened. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just needed that hug today." As Grace chattered about school, Helen thought of the papers, the banker, the whispered voices in the dark. The contrast between Grace's innocence and her parents' scheming burned like fire in her chest. By the time Grace left, Helen had made her decision. She would not wait quietly for betrayal to consume her. She would not leave her fate in the hands of greed. Her son believed she would never change. That was his first mistake. And soon, he would discover it was also his last. The morning after her discoveries, Helen woke with a heaviness that clung to her chest like damp fog. She sat by the window, teacup in hand, staring out at the roses her late husband had planted years ago. Their blooms were fading now, the petals curling inward, but still, they held beauty in their decay. "That's me," she thought. Fading, but not finished. Her mind drifted to the folder of documents she had seen in Teresa's careless rush, the ones marked property appraisal and transfer of ownership. She couldn't shake the image of Victor leaning toward the banker in hushed tones, or the sly way Teresa nudged conversations toward assisted living. For so long, she had let herself believe that neglect was just busyness, that indifference was tiredness, that the distance was only circumstance. But the words, "she'll be gone soon anyway," had stripped away every illusion. Helen set her teacup down with trembling hands. If her own son could not be trusted, she would have to trust herself. That afternoon, she pulled out her old address book, the one with fraying corners and ink-smudged numbers, and dialed a familiar name. "Walter Alcott," a warm voice answered after 2 rings. "Walter, it's Helen." Her voice cracked slightly. I think it's time we talked." Walter's office smelled faintly of leather and old books. The shelves were lined with legal volumes, their spines worn from decades of use, and a grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Helen felt a strange sense of comfort the moment she stepped inside. Walter had been more than just her lawyer. He had been her late husband's college friend, her advisor during Victor's schooling, and, at times, a steady presence when grief threatened to swallow her whole. "Helen," he said, standing to take her hands. His eyes, still sharp despite the gray in his hair, searched hers with concern. "It's been too long. Sit, please." She lowered herself into the chair, her fingers worrying the strap of her handbag. "Walter, I need to talk about my will." His brows lifted. "Your will?" Helen, the last draft we made still stands. Victor is the primary heir, with Grace named in secondary provisions. The words twisted in her chest like a knife. Yes, I know. But things have changed. I've seen sides of Victor the first never wanted to believe were real. Walter leaned back, his expression softening into patience. Tell me. So she did. She told him about the overheard words outside her bedroom door, about the banker, the real estate papers, Teresa's too slick suggestions. She told him about Grace's small acts of kindness, bringing tea, brushing her hair, staying when no one else bothered. She spoke slowly, her voice breaking sometimes, but never once did Walter interrupt. He only listened, nodding gently, as though gathering every shard of her pain. When she finished, silence settled between them, heavy and undeniable. At last, Walter folded his hands. Helen, you've given Victor far more than most children ever receive. A home. Education. Support through every storm. But love cannot blind us forever. If his concern is not for you, but for what you leave behind, then your will no longer reflects your truth. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away. So what do I do? You protect yourself. You decide your legacy on your terms. He reached for a yellow legal pad. There are options. You can redistribute assets, give a portion to Grace, to charities, to the community you've nurtured all these years. You can establish trusts that bypass Victor altogether. Or, his tone sharpened slightly, you can leave Victor with something symbolic, a token, but not the inheritance he assumes is his right. Helen inhaled shakily. Charities. Grace. Community causes. That feels right. Walter nodded. Then we start there. For the next hour, they pored over documents. Walter explained each clause, each adjustment, with the steady clarity of someone who had guided countless clients through storms of family conflict. He suggested setting up a scholarship fund in her late husband's name for local students, donating a portion of the estate to the library Helen cherished, and securing Grace's future with a trust that Teresa and Victor could not touch. With every pen stroke, Helen felt her grief shift. It was still there, an ache for the boy she had raised, for the man she had believed Victor could be, but mingled with it now was something else, empowerment. I never thought I'd be the kind of mother who'd disinherit her son, she whispered at one point, her voice trembling. Walter looked at her kindly. You're not disinheriting him out of spite. You're safeguarding what matters most, your values, your legacy, and those who truly love you. Sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do. She pressed her lips together, nodding. When the final draft was printed, Helen held it in her hands. The pages seemed to hum with weight, of justice, of consequence, of freedom. She thought of Victor's voice again, dismissive, cruel, she'll be gone soon anyway. For the first time since that night, the memory didn't hollow her out. It steeled her. As she rose to leave, Walter placed a hand on her shoulder. Helen, this is only the first step. You'll need discretion. Victor and Teresa mustn't know until the time comes. Can you manage that? Helen gave a small, almost wry smile. I've lived 72 years, Walter. I know how to keep a secret when I must. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, alive with possibility. She walked to her car slowly, cane tapping against the pavement, clutching the new wool against her chest like a shield. For the first time in years, Helen did not feel like prey in her own home. She felt like the hunter, waiting, watching, ready. And though a sliver of guilt coiled in her stomach, another thought rang louder, steadier. He may think I'll be gone soon. But until that day comes, I will not be silenced. I will not be erased. Helen slid into her car, started the engine, and drove home with a quiet determination. The game had changed. Helen had never been one for games, but survival demanded strategy. She knew that Victor and Teresa thrived when they believed her blind and passive. So, to gauge the truth of their hearts, she would give them just enough rope to see whether they meant to hold her steady, or hang her with it. It began subtly. Over supper one evening, she dabbed at her lips with a linen napkin and remarked casually, "You know, I've been thinking of making some new plans for the house." The clink of Victor's fork against his plate was almost imperceptible, but she heard it. His eyes darted up, quick and sharp, before softening into practiced calm. "New plans? What do you mean, Mother?" "Oh, nothing concrete yet," Helen said, keeping her tone light. She swirled her spoon in the bowl of soup, watching steam curl upward like secrets carried away. "Just considering how best to make sure things are in order when the time comes." Teresa leaned forward instantly, her smile stretching a little too wide. "That's very wise, Helen. Planning ahead eases everyone's burden. If you like, I could help organize the paperwork. It's so easy for older eyes to miss the fine print." The sweetness in Teresa's voice was honey over steel, and Helen nearly flinched at its sharpness. But she smiled instead. "How thoughtful, dear. I'll certainly keep that in mind." Across the table, Victor's jaw tightened just slightly. He reached for his water glass, buying himself time. "Well, whatever you decide, of course we'll support you," he said. But his voice lacked ease. Beneath the words lurked something else, a current of worry, even panic. Helen noted every flicker, every inflection. The contrast came a few nights later when Grace stopped by after her shift at the cafe. She arrived with her usual burst of warmth, setting a small bag of pastries on the counter. "I saw these and thought of you, Grandma," Grace said, kissing Helen's cheek. "You've been looking a bit tired lately, so you need some sweetness." Helen chuckled softly. "You'll spoil me, child." As they sat together, Helen tried her test again. "Grace, I've been thinking of making changes to my plans." "About the house?" "About what happens after." She trailed off deliberately. Grace reached across and took her hand without hesitation. "Grandma, you don't need to tell me anything unless you want to. Just promise me you'll do whatever makes you happy. This is your life, your home. Not mine, not Dad's, not anyone's." Helen's throat tightened. The simplicity of the answer, the purity of it, pierced her heart. "Oh, Grace," she whispered, squeezing her hand. The next weeks became a quiet stage play in which each character revealed themselves. Helen would drop hints, "I've been meeting with some old friends lately," or "I've been reflecting on what truly matters in the end." Victor's responses grew more stilted, his laughter brittle around the edges. Teresa's false cheeriness ballooned into suffocating attentiveness, offering to tidy her drawers, hovering with offers of tea she never drank herself, complimenting her outfits with saccharine delight. It was all theater. Helen could see it now. But Grace remained Grace. She came when she could, asked about the garden, listened to stories, and never once pressed for details. Her love required no assurances, no rewards. It simply was. Helen began keeping a leather-bound journal by her bedside, hidden beneath her knitting basket. Each night she wrote letters, not to Victor or Teresa, but to herself, to Grace, to anyone who might one day ask why she made the choices she did. November 3rd, Victor's face today when I mentioned charitable work was almost comical. His eyes narrowed like a gambler's watching a hand slip away. Teresa, meanwhile, insisted she'd love to volunteer with me. I don't believe her for a second. November 7th, Grace stayed until nearly midnight, helping me sort through old photo albums. She cried at the picture of her grandfather holding her as a baby. She said she wants to live a life that would make him proud. I believe she already does. November 10th, I cannot shake the sound of Victor's words that night, "She'll be gone soon anyway." I wonder if he knows they still echo inside me. Perhaps one day, when he reads this, he will understand the wound he made. Her journal became her secret weapon. It was more than documentation, it was insurance. If her intentions were ever questioned, if her sanity was ever doubted, these pages would speak for her when her voice could not. One evening, after writing, Helen paused to stare at her reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back was lined with years, yes, but her eyes still gleamed with fire. She thought of Walter's words, protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do, and felt a renewed strength settle into her bones. The test reached its sharpest point on a Sunday afternoon. Victor had dropped by, unusually nervous, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "Mother," he said suddenly, turning to face her. "You've been secretive lately. Are you sure you're all right? You can tell me if something's wrong." Helen folded her hands calmly in her lap. "Oh, nothing is wrong, Victor. I'm simply making sure my affairs are in order. I want to be certain that when I go, things fall exactly where they should." For a split second, his mask slipped. Panic flared in his eyes, followed by a tight swallow. Then the smile returned, practiced and polished. "Well, as long as you're thinking clearly. You know, it would be terrible if anyone took advantage of you." Helen met his gaze evenly. "Yes, it would." That night, she wrote, "His fear is showing now. Teresa will only grow more desperate. I must be careful, but I am no longer afraid. Let them reveal themselves, I am watching, and I am ready." The tests had run their course. Helen now knew where each heart stood, Victor's chained to greed, Teresa's wrapped in deception, Grace's steady and true. What she did not yet know was how far Victor and Teresa would go once they realized the inheritance they coveted might slip through their grasp. But she had laid the groundwork. She had her lawyer. She had her journal. She had Grace. And she had a fire inside her that neither betrayal nor cruelty could extinguish. The idea for a family dinner came to Helen in the middle of a restless night. She had been lying awake, staring at the shadows stretching across her ceiling, when the thought arrived fully formed: bring them all together. Let the masks crack in the same room. It had been years since her children had shared a table. Victor's strained relationship with Laura had never healed after their father's funeral. Laura had moved 3 states away, visiting only occasionally, her fiery independence clashing with Victor's insistence on control. Helen knew the risk, but perhaps risk was the very thing needed. If truths were to surface, they would surface best when gathered around the same meal, when old memories mixed with new tensions. So she called them all. Victor hesitated, Teresa too sweetly agreed, Grace was delighted, and Laura, after a long pause on the phone, finally said yes. On the evening of the dinner, Helen dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue blouse her late husband had once admired. She moved slowly but with purpose, setting the table herself despite Teresa's offer to help. The silverware gleamed, the crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier, and the roast filled the air with warmth. To anyone else, it might have seemed like an ordinary family gathering. To Helen, it was a stage set for revelation. When the doorbell rang, Victor and Teresa entered first, dressed impeccably as always. Teresa kissed Helen's cheek with exaggerated warmth, her perfume heavy and cloying. Victor's smile was taut, as if stretched across too much strain. Grace arrived shortly after, her energy a bright burst that cut through the heaviness. She immediately offered to help with the dishes, chatting about her cafe and recent art project. And then came Laura. She stepped in with a confidence that filled the room, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "Mother," she said, hugging Helen firmly. "You look strong. Better than I expected." "Thank you, dear," Helen replied, steadying herself. "I'm glad you came." Laura's gaze flicked to Victor, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dinner began with forced pleasantries. The clink of cutlery and low hum of conversation filled the space. Helen guided the talk toward neutral ground, Grace's studies, Laura's recent travels, even Teresa's charity committee. But it was only a matter of time before cracks began to show. Laura, never one to dance around truths, leaned back in her chair and said coolly, "So, Victor, still controlling everything you touch?" Victor froze, fork halfway to his mouth. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Laura replied, her voice calm but sharp as glass. "You've been doing it since we were kids. Always deciding what's best for everyone, as long as it serves you." Teresa jumped in, her laugh brittle. "Oh, Laura, you do love dramatics. Victor's just responsible." Someone has to keep things in order. Laura's eyes narrowed. Responsible? Is that what we're calling it now? The air thickened. Helen's heart pounded, but she let it unfold, watching each word like pieces on a chessboard. It was Teresa, in her eagerness to lighten the mood, who made the fatal mistake. Lifting her glass, she smiled sweetly and said, "Well, one thing's certain. Helen won't be here forever, so let's not waste time arguing about what comes after." The words fell like shattered glass on the table. Silence stretched. Victor's head snapped toward his wife, eyes wide with alarm. Laura's face went white with fury. Grace gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Helen felt the sting of those words strike deep, but she steadied herself, spine straightening in her chair. Her gaze swept across the table, resting first on Teresa, then Victor, then Laura, and finally Grace. "Teresa is right about one thing," Helen said, her voice steady but carrying weight. "I will not be here forever. None of us will. But let me make something clear." She set her glass down slowly, the sound echoing. "The future isn't what you think." Her words lingered in the air, heavy, cryptic, unyielding. Victor tried to recover, his voice quick, almost desperate. "Mother, I'm sure Teresa didn't mean." But Laura cut him off. "Oh, she meant it. She said what you've both been thinking. That's why you're circling like vultures. Waiting." Victor's face flushed. "That's not fair." "Not fair?" Laura's voice rose. "Do you know what wasn't fair? Watching you manipulate everything after Dad died. Acting like the estate was yours to control, pushing me out because I wouldn't bow to your ego. And now you're doing it again with Mother." Teresa's composure cracked, her tone snapping. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Victor's devoted to his mother. Everything he does is for her." Laura laughed bitterly. "For her? Or for the house she lives in?" The room erupted into overlapping voices, Victor protesting, Teresa defending, Laura accusing. Grace looked between them, stricken, her hands gripping the tablecloth. And Helen, sitting at the head of the table, felt a strange calm descend. For once, she did not feel small in the storm of their arguments. She felt like the eye of it. At last, she raised her hand, and the noise stilled. "I invited you all here tonight," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority, "because families should not live on pretense. I wanted to see you together. To remember what it feels like when truth comes to light. And now I have seen enough." Laura's eyes softened, though her jaw remained tight. Victor looked wounded but fearful, Teresa's smile gone, replaced by a nervous twitch of her lips. Grace, bless her heart, looked only at Helen with concern. The meal ended awkwardly, plates half finished, conversation reduced to shallow fragments. When they finally left, Victor's arm tight around Teresa's waist, Laura storming out alone, and Grace lingering with a hug, Helen remained at the table. The candles had burned low, wax spilling onto silver holders. The roast sat cold, untouched. She stared at the remnants and felt the weight of her own words pressing back into her chest. "The future isn't what you think." She had delivered her warning, not as a threat, but as a truth. Whether they understood it now or not, the course had already shifted. The game was no longer Victor's to control. And for the first time, Helen felt a glimmer of something fierce beneath her sorrow. Power. The morning after the dinner, Helen woke with an ache in her chest that felt heavier than usual. She pushed herself upright slowly, each breath shallow, each movement weighed down by exhaustion. The night had taken more from her than she cared to admit. The arguments, Teresa's cruel slip of the tongue, Victor's tight-lipped fear, it all pressed against her heart like a stone. She tried to stand, but the room tilted. A wave of dizziness knocked her back onto the mattress, her vision narrowing into darkness. When she came to, the light outside had shifted. Her blouse clung damply to her skin, and her mouth was dry as sand. She reached for the water glass on her nightstand, her hands trembling so badly she nearly spilled it. A single thought circled her mind: is this how it ends? Quietly, alone? By late afternoon, Grace found her. She had come unannounced, as she often did, carrying a bag of groceries and humming softly as she let herself in with the spare key. "Grandma?" Grace called. No answer. When she climbed the stairs and saw Helen slumped on the bed, pale and weak, the groceries fell to the floor with a thud. "Grandma." Helen tried to smile, though it barely reached her lips. "Just a spell, dear. Don't fuss." But Grace did fuss. She called the doctor, fetched water, pressed cool cloths to her forehead until color returned to her cheeks. News of the episode spread quickly, though not through Helen herself. It was Teresa who told Victor, and Teresa who wasted no time in telling others. At a brunch with her friends, she leaned in over champagne glasses and whispered, "It won't be long now." Poor Helen had quite the scare this week. "Victor and I are already preparing, just practical matters, you understand. The house, the accounts. It's all essentially ours anyway." Her friends gasped and cooed, offering both sympathy and envy. Teresa soaked it in, imagining the life that awaited her once the transition was over, a bigger car, lavish vacations, a home redone to her liking. Victor, meanwhile, interpreted Helen's weakness as opportunity. He had always been decisive, but now he was emboldened. He called the banker again, pushing for valuations. He spoke to a real estate agent, using phrases like "my property" and "our timeline." When the agent asked about Helen's consent, Victor waved it off. She won't be making these decisions much longer. At home, Helen noticed the subtle shifts: phone calls hushed when she entered a room, paperwork hidden a little too quickly, Teresa's eagerness to offer her rest while quietly nudging her toward irrelevance. They believed the scare had weakened her, had made her pliable. But they underestimated her resolve. One evening, Helen sat propped against her pillows, her journal open on her lap. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote. November 17th, today I overheard Teresa on the phone, laughing about how soon they'll have everything. They see me as a clock ticking down. But the truth is, my time is not theirs to claim. I am still here. I will not leave quietly. If they think I am finished, they are mistaken. She closed the journal, slid it back beneath the knitting basket, and allowed herself a smile. Weakness could be a mask too. The shock came a week later, at Sunday lunch. Victor and Teresa arrived expecting to find Helen bedridden, fragile, perhaps even ready to be persuaded into signing papers. Instead, she greeted them at the door, standing tall, hair neatly brushed, wearing the pearl earrings Victor's father had once given her. "Mother," Victor stammered, his face paling. "You look radiant," Teresa added quickly, her voice brittle with forced delight. "Do I?" Helen asked, her smile sharp. "Well, it's amazing what a little rest will do. I'm not gone yet, despite what some of you may think." The words hung in the air, an arrow loosed without disguise. Teresa's lips parted, but no sound came. Victor glanced at her, panic flickering across his face before he masked it with a strained chuckle. "Of course not, Mother. We never doubted you." But Helen saw the truth in his eyes. Doubt, fear, calculation. They had gambled on her decline and lost, for now. That night, when they left, Helen returned to her journal. November 24th, they are rattled. They thought me frail, already fading. Today I stood before them and reminded them, I am still Helen Ellison. I am still the woman who built this family. They do not know it yet, but the future they dream of will never belong to them. It is mine to shape. Her hand steadied as she underlined the last words, mine to shape. For the first time in weeks, she slept peacefully. The house felt too quiet after her recovery. Helen sat in the den with an old photo album open on her lap, the kind that smelled faintly of leather and pressed flowers. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced her late husband Robert's face with her fingertips. It had been nearly 20 years since his passing, yet his voice still lingered in her memory. "Victor will take care of you," Robert had told her once, his eyes filled with pride. Back then, she had believed it. Victor was their firstborn, their golden boy, the one Robert always leaned on when it came to family matters. Robert had trusted Victor without question, and Helen had allowed herself to do the same. Now, looking back, she felt that trust had been misplaced, or perhaps too heavily burdened upon a son who had learned entitlement instead of responsibility. The images in the photo album pulled her backward in time. She saw Victor at 10 years old, standing proudly at his school play while she clapped louder than anyone else. She saw him at 15, asking her for extra money to go out with friends, and her giving it willingly even when the bills were tight. She remembered the way she stitched his football uniform late at night when Robert was working overtime, and how Victor had barely said thank you. She flipped to another page and saw Laura, her second child, standing off to the side in many of the photographs. Laura's smile was always smaller, her eyes less certain. Helen's heart ached with guilt. Laura had felt like the shadow to Victor's sunlight, and she had never truly forgiven her mother for it. Helen remembered the fights, Laura accusing her of favoritism, of caring only for Victor's future while ignoring her daughter's needs. At the time, Helen had brushed it off as teenage rebellion. Now she saw it differently. Laura had been crying out for balance, for love that wasn't conditional on being the family's responsible daughter while Victor was excused again and again. The memories were heavy, and she set the album aside. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden Robert had planted years ago. She could almost hear his voice again, low and reassuring, telling her not to dwell on regrets. But it was impossible not to. That evening, Helen sat down with a box of letters Robert had written her during their early years of marriage. One in particular caught her attention. It was a letter from the year Victor was born. Robert had written about his dreams for their son, how he believed Victor would grow into a man of honor and loyalty. Helen's chest tightened as she read. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had soured. Her mind wandered to Laura again. Unlike Victor, Laura had been cautious with money, suspicious of promises, and protective of her independence. Helen remembered the day Laura had stormed out at 19, declaring she wouldn't live under the same roof where Victor's needs always came first. That was the day the family split, and Helen hadn't been able to mend the wound since. It was no wonder Laura's arrival at the dinner had been so sharp, her words laced with old resentment. Helen had failed her daughter in many ways, and the guilt pressed heavily now. Still, when she thought of Victor, she realized something deeper. Her favoritism had not only hurt Laura, but it had enabled Victor to believe that the world would bend to his wants. That belief now threatened to consume everything she had worked for. Later that night, Helen walked through the halls of the house. Every corner was filled with echoes of Robert's trust in Victor. His study still held files with Victor's name scribbled in Robert's hand. The garage carried tools Robert once promised would be Victor's inheritance. Even the porch swing had stories, nights Robert and Victor had sat side by side, discussing the future, while Helen and Laura had listened quietly from inside. But as she moved through the house, Helen realized something. Robert's trust had been based on hope, not certainty. And hope was not a will, not a binding contract, not an excuse to ignore reality. She paused at the threshold of Victor's old room, still half preserved from his youth. Posters of rock bands hung on the walls, and a trophy from his high school football team gathered dust on the shelf. For years she had kept it as a shrine, believing he would always return to her as the dutiful son. Now, standing there, she saw it differently. It wasn't a shrine. It was a monument to her own denial. The past whispered to her as she shut the door. She knew the decision she had made, to change her will, to alter the future, was not just about punishing Victor. It was about correcting a lifetime of imbalance. It was about finally acknowledging Laura's pain, Grace's innocence, and her own need for peace in her final years. She returned to the den and wrote in her journal, the one Grace had gifted her for Christmas. Her handwriting was shaky but clear. I gave too much to Victor because I believed he was Robert's legacy. But Laura was my legacy too. And Grace, she is hope. To save what matters, I must choose differently now. It isn't betrayal, it's justice. The words steadied her heart. The shadows of the past no longer felt like prisons, but lessons. And though they weighed heavy, they gave her clarity. Victor might carry Robert's name and pride, but he did not carry the love, the humility, or the gratitude that made a true heir. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time in years, Helen felt she was no longer bound to the past. She was finally beginning to see the path ahead clearly, one that required courage, but also one that honored truth. The morning Helen decided to confront them, the house seemed unusually still. She brewed tea slowly, her movements deliberate, as though each measured stir of the spoon carried the weight of her decision. The porcelain cup sat neatly on the table, gleaming under the soft afternoon light filtering through the curtains. Helen set 3 chairs around the table, hers at the head, Victor to her right, Teresa to her left. It felt ceremonial, like the stage of a play where every line and gesture would matter. When Victor and Teresa arrived, they were in high spirits. Victor carried himself with the careless confidence of a man who thought he was already in control of the future. Teresa wore her usual polished smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. They kissed Helen on the cheek, asked perfunctory questions about her health, and then sat, utterly unaware of the storm about to break. Helen poured the tea, steady despite the tension rising in her chest. She let them sip in silence before she spoke. "I know what you've been planning," she said, her voice calm but cold enough to make Teresa's teacup clink against its saucer. Victor froze mid-sip. "What are you talking about, Mother?" he asked with a practiced laugh, trying to diffuse the weight in the room. Helen looked at him steadily, her eyes unblinking. "I heard you, Victor. That night. You said, she'll be gone soon anyway. Those were your words. My own son, counting down my days." The room fell into a tense silence. Victor shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. "You must have misheard." "I didn't," Helen interrupted sharply. "And I didn't stop there. I've seen the papers Teresa so carelessly left on the counter. Real estate listings. Contracts. Plans to sell this house, as though I were already in the ground." Teresa's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth to protest but no words came out. Her hand trembled as she reached for her teacup again, spilling a few drops on the lace tablecloth. Helen leaned closer. "I also spoke to Laura. She confirmed what she's overheard. And Grace." Her voice softened briefly. "Grace has seen more than you realize. She noticed the way you whisper in the kitchen, the way you avoid my eyes when you think you're close to getting what you want." Victor slammed his cup down so hard the tea splashed. His voice rose, his temper flaring. "So now you're turning my own family against me? You're listening to Laura, who's hated me since we were children, and to Grace, who doesn't understand a damn thing about adult responsibilities." "Careful," Helen said, her voice low but razor-sharp. "It's not Laura or Grace you need to fear. It's the truth. And the truth is that you betrayed me long before I ever betrayed you." Teresa tried to interject, her tone saccharine but trembling. "Helen, darling, this is all a misunderstanding. Victor was only worried about your health. We wanted to be prepared, that's all. You wouldn't want to leave things unsettled." Helen fixed her with a stare that made Teresa shrink back in her chair. "Prepared? By contacting agents behind my back? By telling your friends you'll soon inherit everything? That isn't preparation. That's greed." Victor's face hardened, his mask of charm finally slipping. His eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with resentment. "You don't understand, do you? I've put my whole life into this family. I've always been the one expected to carry the weight, to make sure things ran smoothly after Father died. And what did I get in return? Criticism. Comparison. Nothing was ever enough for you or Laura." Helen's heart twisted, but she held her ground. "What you got, Victor, was privilege. You got my sacrifices. You got more than your sister ever did, more than you ever deserved. And yet you stand here, angry that I won't let you bury me alive for the sake of a house." The air between them was thick with years of unspoken grievances. Teresa fidgeted, looking from one to the other, clearly realizing that the situation was slipping beyond her ability to charm or manipulate. Helen reached into her drawer and pulled out a folded document. She placed it neatly on the table. I've already been to Walter. The will has been changed. The charities Robert and I supported will receive what we built. Grace will be cared for. Laura will finally have her share. As for you, Victor, her voice did not waver. You're no longer in my will. The silence that followed was absolute. Teresa gasped audibly, covering her mouth. Victor's face went pale, then flushed with furious color. He stood so suddenly his chair toppled backward. You can't do this. He shouted, his hands trembling with rage. Everything in this house, everything Father built, it was supposed to come to me. You're making a mistake. You'll regret this. Helen looked up at him, unflinching. The mistake was believing you would honor me. The regret is yours, not mine. Victor's chest heaved as though he might strike the table, but Teresa grabbed his arm, whispering frantically, "Sit down, Victor. Please." But Victor didn't sit. He glared at Helen with a fury she had never seen in him before, a fury that revealed not grief or hurt, but naked entitlement. For a fleeting moment, Helen saw not the boy she had raised, but the man he had become, someone her husband would never have recognized, someone Robert's dreams could never justify. Finally, Victor turned, storming toward the door. This isn't over, he growled. Teresa lingered behind, her mask slipping into desperation. Helen, please, you can't mean this. You know Victor has a temper, but deep down he loves you. Helen's lips curved into the faintest, saddest smile. If that's love, Teresa, then I pray Grace never learns it from either of you. Teresa's face crumpled. She followed Victor out, the front door slamming behind them with a sound that echoed through the house like a final verdict. Helen sat alone at the table, the untouched tea cooling in its cups. She should have felt empty, but instead, there was a quiet strength inside her chest. The storm had broken, but she had weathered it. And though the confrontation had cut deep, she knew one truth with absolute certainty: she had taken her power back. She whispered softly into the quiet room, almost as if Robert were listening, "They thought I'd be gone soon. But I've only just begun to live on my own terms." The weeks after the confrontation were far from peaceful. Victor, humiliated and enraged, wasted no time in retaliating. Within a month, Helen was served with formal notice: Victor was contesting the will. His claim was clear: she had been unduly influenced, manipulated by Laura and Walter, too frail in body and mind to make rational decisions. When Helen first read the document, her hands shook, not from fear, but from sorrow. It was one thing for her son to whisper betrayal in the shadows of her home, it was another to drag her name through the courts, reducing her final wishes to a battlefield. Teresa, of course, stood at his side, whispering like a serpent about protecting their rightful inheritance. Walter, however, remained steady. "We were prepared for this," he assured Helen in his office, the oak shelves heavy with law books behind him. "You took the right steps. You documented everything, you kept letters, you recorded your thoughts. You left nothing to chance. He'll fight hard, but he doesn't have the truth on his side." The trial began in the county courthouse, a modest building that seemed too small to contain the weight of family betrayal. On one side sat Victor, his expensive suit doing little to hide the restless tapping of his foot. Teresa perched beside him, whispering strategies, her eyes sharp and hungry. On the other sat Helen, dressed simply but with quiet dignity. Laura was behind her, arms crossed, protective in her silence. And Grace, pale but resolute, sat at her grandmother's side, refusing to be sent home. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the case was called. Victor's lawyer painted a picture of a frail old woman manipulated by bitter relatives. He spoke of Laura's resentment, of Walter's long friendship with Helen, even of Grace's supposed naivete. He suggested that Helen hadn't known what she was doing when she changed her will, that the entire act was the result of emotional coercion. When it was Walter's turn, he rose calmly and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, this is not the story of a confused old woman. This is the story of a mother who finally saw the truth about her son's intentions. And we have the evidence to prove it. Piece by piece, he laid it out. Helen's journal entries, written in her own hand, detailing the neglect, the overheard conversations, the fears she endured. Letters she had written to Laura and Grace, recording her observations, her doubts, and her plans. Even the recordings Walter had insisted she make, her own voice, clear and unwavering, explaining exactly why she was changing her will. The effect was devastating. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Helen's voice filled the room from a small speaker. I am of sound mind. I know what I am doing. I cannot allow my estate to go to someone who has already betrayed my trust. This is not revenge. It is protection, for myself, and for those I love. Victor's face flushed red as the recording played. He shifted in his seat, his bravado slipping into visible discomfort. Teresa squeezed his hand, but even she looked shaken. The most powerful moment, however, came when Grace was called to the stand. At first, she looked small against the vastness of the courtroom. But when asked about her experiences, her voice grew steady. I've seen how my dad talks about Grandma, she said, her eyes flicking briefly to Victor before returning to the judge. He acts like she's already gone. He doesn't ask if she's okay, he asks when she'll be out of the way. When she got sick, he didn't rush to help her. He told people she wouldn't last the year. That isn't love. That isn't care. The words hung heavy in the air. Victor tried to glare her into silence, but Grace didn't flinch. She sat taller, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The truth, coming from a granddaughter's mouth, was undeniable. Then came Laura's testimony, the most surprising of all. For years she had carried resentment toward her mother, but when asked about Victor, her voice was firm. My brother has always believed the world owed him something, she said, her tone cold and certain. When we were children, my mother sacrificed everything for him, her time, her money, even her attention to me. And still, it was never enough. He has always been entitled, and now he is trying to take what isn't his to take. My mother finally saw it, and she made the right choice. For once, she put her trust where it belonged. Helen sat motionless, her heart breaking and healing all at once. Laura's words cut deep with truth, but beneath the bitterness there was something else, a fragile bridge of loyalty, a daughter defending her mother not out of obligation, but conviction. When it came time for the judge's ruling, the tension was unbearable. Helen clasped her hands in her lap, her breath shallow but steady. The judge adjusted his glasses and spoke deliberately. After reviewing the evidence, the written records, the testimony, and the recordings, it is clear that Mrs. Whittaker acted with full awareness and intention when she revised her will. The claim of undue influence is unsubstantiated. The court upholds the validity of the new will in its entirety. The words rang like a gavel strike before the actual sound followed. Case closed. Victor shot to his feet, his voice sharp and angry. This isn't justice. This is manipulation. She's been poisoned against me. But the bailiff stepped forward, and the judge's warning glare silenced him. Teresa tugged at his arm, trying to pull him back, her whispers frantic. But Victor's face was twisted with fury, his eyes darting to Helen with a venom that chilled her. Helen, however, felt no fear. She sat taller, her chin raised. For the first time in years, she felt free. The law had not only validated her decision but also stripped Victor of his last weapon. As the courtroom emptied, Helen turned to Walter, who placed a steady hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said softly. You've protected your future. Laura lingered nearby, her eyes unreadable. When Helen met her gaze, Laura gave a small, reluctant nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something, a beginning. And Grace, sweet Grace, hugged her grandmother tightly, whispering, You were so brave, Grandma. So brave. Helen held her close, her voice breaking with quiet emotion. No, my dear. You were the brave one. You reminded me of what love looks like. Behind them, Victor and Teresa stormed out of the courthouse, their plans in ruins. Helen knew the battle had cost her, but she also knew the victory was worth it. For once, the truth had prevailed, and she had ensured her legacy would not be twisted by betrayal. She walked out into the afternoon sun, the courthouse steps bathed in golden light. The air felt lighter, her steps steadier. And though the shadows of betrayal still lingered, Helen knew she had faced them head-on and emerged with her dignity intact. The war was over. The future was hers. The courtroom battle had ended, but the echo of it lingered in every corner of Helen's life. Victor did not call, did not visit, did not even send a message of bitterness. Instead, he retreated into silence, a silence heavy with resentment. Word reached Helen through neighbors and whispers in town. Victor had shut himself away, drowning in anger and self-pity. At first, she felt the ache of that absence. For all his cruelty, Victor was still her son. The boy she had once held in her arms, the child she had sacrificed so much for, was now a stranger carved from pride and entitlement. She wondered if Robert, her late husband, would have blamed her, or if he, too, would have seen the truth in what their son had become. But no matter how she framed it, Helen could no longer bear the weight of his bitterness. She had chosen peace, and she would live in that choice. Teresa's absence, however, came with its own twist. Unlike Victor, she did not vanish quietly. Within months, Teresa had left him. She had been tethered to the promise of wealth, of comfort, of a future built on inheritance rather than effort. When that future evaporated, so too did her loyalty. Helen heard through a mutual acquaintance that Teresa had packed her bags one stormy night and told Victor she refused to waste her best years living in mediocrity. Her departure was final, her affection as conditional as Helen had always suspected. Victor was left alone, stripped of both inheritance and companionship. Helen felt sorrow for him, but it was the sorrow one feels for someone who has chosen their own ruin. She could no longer carry the burden of his life. He had made his choices. And so, she turned her attention to the family that remained. Grace became her daily joy. The young girl's laughter filled the house, restoring warmth to rooms that had felt heavy with silence. They spent afternoons in the garden, Helen teaching her how to tend to the roses Robert had once planted, Grace listening with wide eyes as if every word were a treasure. "You'll make them grow," Helen told her one afternoon, pressing her granddaughter's soil-streaked hands between her own. "Not because you have my blood, but because you have my love. That's what keeps things alive." Laura's return was slower, more delicate. At first, she came only for short visits, her tone guarded, her words clipped. But gradually, the walls softened. They began to share tea together, to walk through the market, to reminisce about Robert in ways that felt safe again. One evening, as the sun sank low, Laura finally said what Helen had longed to hear: "You made mistakes, Mother. But so did I. And maybe it's not too late for us." Tears had filled Helen's eyes as she clasped her daughter's hand. "It's never too late," she whispered. In that moment, the years of bitterness seemed to fall away. They were not erased, but they no longer ruled over them. With peace blooming at home, Helen felt compelled to leave something lasting behind, not just for her children, but for the world beyond her family. She met with Walter once more, outlining her desire to create a scholarship fund in Robert's name. He always believed in education, she explained. He wanted children to have opportunities he never had. If his name can open doors for others, then his legacy will live on in something pure. Walter smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. "This will be his monument," he said. "One that no bitterness can touch." The scholarship fund was established within the year, supporting students in need from their community. Helen attended the first award ceremony, watching a nervous young woman accept the inaugural scholarship. In the girl's bright eyes, she saw Robert's dreams reborn, and for the first time in decades, Helen felt completely at peace with the choices she had made. As her health began to wane again, Helen turned to her journal one final time. She wrote a letter to Grace, sealing it with care, to be opened when the girl was old enough to truly understand. "My dearest Grace. By now, you know that life is not always fair, and family does not always mean kindness. But here is what I've learned in the years I've walked this earth: blood binds us, but love decides our legacy. I want you to remember that, no matter what. Love bravely. Love generously. That is the true inheritance I leave you. When the letter was complete, Helen placed it in a box with Robert's old pocket watch, the one he had carried every day of his working life. It was not wealth, but it was meaning, and she hoped Grace would understand the depth of it one day. The final months of her life were quiet but full. She spent them in the company of Laura and Grace, surrounded by laughter, small joys, and the steady hum of a family mended, if not entirely healed. She no longer feared the future. She had faced betrayal, she had made her choice, and she had carved peace out of the wreckage. When the end finally came, Helen left not just a house, not just a name, but a legacy built on love, courage, and truth. Victor, somewhere in his bitterness, would never understand it. Teresa, chasing shadows of wealth, would never touch it. But Laura and Grace, those who had chosen her, who had stood with her when it mattered, would carry it forward. And so, Helen's final choice became not about wealth, not about punishment, but about legacy itself. The kind of legacy that cannot be contested in court or divided on paper. The kind that lives in hearts, in memories, and in the quiet strength of those who come after. The house was quiet in the days leading up to Helen's passing, not with the silence of neglect, but with the gentle hush of love. Grace moved through the rooms softly, tending to her grandmother's needs with patient devotion. Laura was there too, her hands steady on Helen's shoulder when the nights grew restless, her voice low and soothing when pain threatened to overwhelm. Friends from the community came and went, bringing food, prayers, and comfort, a steady stream of kindness that reminded Helen she was far from alone. In her final hours, she lay in the bed where she had once shared mornings with her husband, the room filled with the scent of fresh lilies from her garden. The window was cracked open, letting in the late spring air. Grace held one hand, Laura the other. Helen's eyes fluttered open one last time, her gaze moving between them. She whispered a simple truth, "I am at peace." And with a quiet sigh, she slipped away, leaving behind not only a family but a legacy forged through fire and forgiveness. The funeral was held in the town's oldest church, its stone walls echoing with hymns that seemed to carry her spirit higher with every note. The pews were filled with neighbors, former students she had once tutored, recipients of her generosity who now stood as living proof of the lives she had touched. The scholarship fund had already begun its work, and young men and women came forward to speak about the doors Helen's gift had opened for them. Victor came too, though no one had expected it. He stood at the very back of the church, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow. He did not speak, did not greet his sister or daughter. He only watched, shoulders hunched, as the service unfolded. For the first time, Helen's community saw him not as the entitled heir but as a man diminished, broken by his own choices, standing in the shadow of a woman he had underestimated. His absence from the heart of the gathering was louder than any eulogy. Laura spoke at the pulpit, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. She did not hide the truth of their strained relationship but honored the woman her mother had been, strong, flawed, loving, and above all, resilient. "She taught me," Laura said, "that it is never too late to begin again. Even in our final chapters, we can choose love over bitterness. And that choice changes everything." When it was Grace's turn, she unfolded the letter her grandmother had left her. The words rang through the sanctuary, a testament to Helen's vision: "Blood binds us, but love decides our legacy." There was a hush in the air as she finished, as though every soul in the room carried the weight of those words. Grace's hands trembled, but her chin lifted proudly. She had inherited more than wealth, she had inherited a responsibility to carry forward the values her grandmother had lived by. As the casket was lowered into the earth, a light breeze swept across the cemetery, stirring the petals of white roses that had been laid upon the grave. Laura rested her hand on Grace's shoulder, and together they stood, not as a fractured family but as one newly mended, holding on to the strength Helen had given them. In the weeks that followed, the town spoke of Helen often. Her story was retold in coffee shops, in classrooms, in the quiet of living rooms where neighbors remembered her kindness. The scholarship fund grew, supported by donations from those who believed in her vision. And in every corner of the community, there was a sense that Helen's spirit lived on, not just in stone or paper, but in the choices people made to honor her memory. Grace kept her grandmother's letter on her desk, framed and visible. Whenever doubt crept in, she would read those words aloud. They became her compass, guiding her studies, her relationships, her dreams. One day, she knew, she would pass them on to her own children, ensuring that Helen's story was never lost to time. For in the end, Helen's greatest triumph was not in what she kept, but in what she gave away: love, wisdom, and a legacy that greed could never touch. If Helen's journey moved you, let it remind us all that family isn't about entitlement, it's about love, loyalty, and the choices we make when tested. Greed destroys, but kindness leaves a legacy that lasts beyond our lifetime. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or the comfort of true connection, share this story with someone who needs it today. And if you believe in the power of resilience, subscribe for more stories that echo life's deepest lessons. Together, let's carry forward the truth that love, not wealth, is our greatest inheritance.